When we developed He-Man, I had no idea that it was going to be what it turned out to be. I mean, you can't plan hits. I mean, that's the wonderful part of showbiz. I mean, if they're worthwhile, they'll work somehow. I just knew it was a way to keep a lot of people working for at least a year. And when the thing went on, when we saw the letters that started coming in, it was extraordinary. I mean, it was just really a phenomenon. It was probably the first show that was that successful in the history of animation.
From 1965 to 1988, American animation studio Filmation developed and created dozens of popular television series and several feature films. Many of them featured larger-than-life licensed heroes, such as Superman, Batman, Captain Marvel, Tarzan, Zorro, or the cast of Star Trek. But one hero would rule the airwaves and carve out a place in television history. Join us now to explore the secret origins of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. In the wake of the success of science fiction films such as the Star Wars and various superhero films and television series, the sword and sorcery milieu was about to be invigorated.
I guess Tom Kalinske called me. He was president of Mattel at the time. And he said they had this character called He-Man. He said, would you be interested? I assumed it was going to be for Saturday morning because it was the only way you could get something done was go to the network, try to sell a show. If they bought the show, they usually paid you almost enough to do the show. And then the foreign sales would make up the difference. And so I said, yeah, I'd like to do it. And I knew that we weren't going to be very busy. And I also knew that I was really getting to the place where it was so difficult to sell a network show and so unrewarding creatively that there had to be something else that would be done that could help the industry stay awake during those periods.
After approaching ABC, CBS, and NBC in early 1982 and being turned down, Scheimer hatched a plan to sell He-Man and the Masters of the Universe into syndication as a first-run syndicated show, airing an unprecedented 65 new episodes on weekdays.
He-Man not only was the first show that was produced 65 episodes in one season, it was also the first show to go in what was called first-run syndication. And this hadn't really been done before for cartoons, and it really created a new business, a whole new business model that frankly ended up evolving into the Nick's and the Disney channels and the Cartoon Networks that dominate children's television today. Prior to He-Man, there really wasn't original production that was made to be aired 5 days a week. It was only made for Saturday morning. So He-Man was breakthrough, not only in terms of its content, and not only in terms of the number of shows that were produced, but in terms of how those shows were broadcast.
65 allowed the stations to have 4 runs a year. And it was on a daily basis that they only had to show the show once every 3 months or something like that. And it was a number that allowed them to have a rotation in the shows that was not overwhelming.
He knew what reruns were and what they meant to the company, and no one had really pioneered making brand new syndicated shows, which were in essence brand new reruns. You know, I mean, obviously everything's planned to make money in reruns, but Lou planned to create a new dynasty for Filmation, and he stuck out his territory in working with the smaller networks, the small independent stations all across the country.
To sell the series to the independently owned television syndication market, Lou and Westinghouse executives went to a convention called NATPE, the National Association for Television Production Executives, in July 1982. They brought with them development materials from the show and ran into the man who was the star of the just-released feature film, Conan the Barbarian.
We had all of our drawings, we had some storyboards there, and it was interesting. People came up and they saw these drawings, they liked this characters, and we talked about the fact that we're going to do them with the pro-social values built into the show. And I look up at one guy, and he was looking at some of the drawings. I said, "That's Arnold Schwarzenegger."
Yeah. It was funny.
And he was looking at these drawings and, and you could tell he was ticked off.
Little did we know he'd be our governor.
Yeah, that's right. I wasn't calling him High Gov in those days.
I got involved with He-Man because there were 5 directors at that time. And Lou came to me, Lou Scheimer, and said that they had to have a really quick, like 3 minutes of full animation to present to a trade show to sell the series. So we were in the middle of production on our other shows at the time, so Lou said, "You're going to do this after hours." So I pulled in a couple Disney animators and had some of my own crew working after hours, and I literally stayed every night and it was just not even a complete scene, just a series of drawings going from my desk right to the assistants, just kind of keep the stuff rolling because we were really up against a really tight schedule. And we did it. They took it to the trade show and it sold the series.
While the series was being sold into syndication, work had already begun in earnest on the series itself. But even as the Filmation crew prepared the world of Eternia to be unveiled to kids everywhere, Lou Scheimer was faced with some real-world concerns in the form of protests.
This was coming off of the 70s, which was the most regulated era of children's television, where no violence was allowed, and this was all the result of Action for Children's Television, otherwise known as ACT. And what had happened in the 70s was all of violence and adventure and everything was basically just knocked out of children's television, and it became very pat, very puerile. There was no Johnny Quest, there was no superheroes really to speak of. I mean, it was basically the era of Scooby-Doo. And Scooby-Doo sort of came out of the fact that they couldn't do anything else with action.
That was one of the funniest things about this show is before it even got on the air, they were up in arms about how violent it was going to be. And I remember just being so frustrated because nobody'd seen a frame of film.
He-Man was a real lightning rod in its time for the kinds of critics that paid no attention to the content of the show. Because I think if you saw the content of He-Man, you would be, I think there's not a lot to complain about in terms of violence and lessons and messages it's giving.
My Lasertron will stop you, He-Man. Let me give you a hand.
He-Man obviously was primarily an action show, but I think what differentiated it from others of its genre and why it has resonated for so long and so deeply is it was about family. It was about a family of characters that really cared about each other, and it had a moral tone. It had a lesson and a message that underlied all the action, and it also had comedy, and so you know, every episode had an action goal and a conflict that resulted in action. But there was always far more going on beneath the surface.
Arthur was very, very concerned always about story and character development and doing nothing that would harm our young audience, the children. He always wanted to make sure that everything was positive and pro-social values and nothing that children could imitate. He was always very concerned about that. Very, very responsible. And in fact, we hired Don Roberts as a consultant to go over every story and make sure that there was nothing detrimental to children, everything had a pro-social value to it.
I got premises and scripts from writers, and my job was to say, is there a concept in here that can be highlighted, emphasized, reshaped to teach children some kind of a pro-social message, some kind of element of character, some kind of element of behavior, something that we want our kids to know. And so my task was saying, here's the characters, they're a given. Here's the world, that's a given. Now it's the story, and how can I work with the story to emphasize the kinds of things that I would hope kids would learn. The approach I wanted to take with that program was that whatever the lesson was about is what the show should be about.
Politics and the economic recession played a role in the development of He-Man, as the Federal Communications Commission made some major changes in policy.
The United States was going through everything to try to increase, to get out of the recession. We had oil problems in those days, worse than we had now. And of course, this was one way to help stimulate the economy. So they thought that if they relaxed the FCC rules, they would be able to generate more income from the private sector. Relaxing the FCC rules allowed manufacturers to make their own programming, again, which they hadn't done since the early 60s when they used to fully own a whole television show.
Even as Lou Scheimer was working out business deals and battling controversy, Arthur Nadell and Hal Sutherland were working with the writers and animators to explore the vast and